And now we move on to the open lecture for tonight to be presented by Maria MacNamara and Catherine Ball. They're conducting this as a conversation, or Maria is convening this as a conversation with Catherine on the subject Convergence and the Hybridisation of the Future. You can read Maria's formal bio in the notice for this meeting, but her story, which is long, but I've shortened a little bit, is that she is by nature curious and busy, and has varied interests ranging from music to quantum encryption. Maria is dedicated to seeing the nation upskilled, our national systems modernised, and our leaders being called to account on issues such as the unconscionable rise in poverty and the need to deliver quality education to all. She notes, and you can talk to her about this later in the library bar after the open lecture, that she is a member of the, quote, much ignored Gen X. Maria will give a fuller introduction to Catherine Ball, who in short is a futurist, author, researcher, rebel, and a much sought after speaker. I'm pleased to say that Catherine is on stage here tonight and will also be speaking at the Society's annual forum held in partnership with the 5 Learned Academies. This will be in Government House on the 2nd of November this year, and Catherine is speaking in the session on turbocharging human intelligence with artificial intelligence. The theme for the day of the forum, as you may have seen in the slides as they went past, is our 21st century brain. It promises to be fascinating. So Maria and Catherine, welcome to the stage.
Well, hello. Great to see you all, and thank you very much for having us. We're very excited about this conversation and to see so many friendly faces in the audience, ones we didn't expect. Catherine and I met briefly before the start of this evening in the library bar, which we recommend to you. It's just a beautiful place, and John Valence has done the most remarkable job with it. So if you haven't been, it's a good time and a good place to go. During that conversation, Catherine obviously has a very detailed CV on her website, and I would recommend it to you. But just as Susan introduced my story, what I wanted to hear was Catherine's story. And she remarked that she's the child of a single-parent family. And there was a message her mother constantly gave her, and that was to see them off, Catherine. And she had a mother that supported her sense of curiosity, and that's the one thing that Catherine and I have in common. And she's also focused on being her true self. She has a strong moral justice thread running through her work and her opinions, and she's driven by purpose. In terms of her education, she started with a gap year in Africa, in Zambia, during the AIDS pandemic, and worked with orphans. And she has a degree in environmental protection, a PhD in microbiology and soil. And she's an honorary Doctor of Science with the Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. She advises billionaires, although she isn't one. So she works with Schmidt Futures and the X Prize, and I'd encourage you to ask questions in relation to the work that she's doing with her. And Catherine is known for putting her money where her mouth is, so she's an entrepreneur as well. Catherine's the author of Converge, a book that she wrote 2 years ago, and it was timely then and already out of date now.
But it's still worth reading if you haven't.
And I wanted to begin by asking her why she felt the need to write the book then.
So I wrote the first manuscript for this book between 7 p.m. and 2 a.m. over 18 evenings with a sinus infection and a 3-year-old that wouldn't sleep. And I did it because I was just so deeply frustrated that I hadn't done it yet. We were coming out of the pandemic, and I was like, I've had 2 years to do something, and I have not done something. I need to quickly do something. And so I wrote it really, and this might sound contrite, but bear with me. I wrote it for the housewives of Toowoomba. I wrote it for people who maybe didn't like science at school, maybe didn't have a formal qualification or a job vocation, and being a housewife is not an easy task. Okay, it's not to be derogatory to people that stay at home. It's to show people that when they stay at home, they are still so important for their children, for their family, for their communities, to stay literate in things like technology. And just because someone doesn't work a job in the stock exchange or in an ASX 200 listed company doesn't mean they can't contribute something. But we've got a real problem here in Australia. And that problem for me that I wanted to write this book for is our general level of tech literacy is so nowhere near where it should be. And so I pictured having had my mum, for example, remortgage and refinance the house so I could finish my PhD. I pictured what I would look like if I was to go through university nowadays in the UK, which is a very different place to the UK that I used to live in. More and more when I look at the UK, I don't recognise it as a place that I used to live. It's really very much a foreign country to me in many ways. But my mum and I worked out that no, I wouldn't have been able to afford to go to university. And no, she wouldn't have been able to put me through it. And no, it wouldn't have necessarily worked purely financially. That's how close I was to being that housewife in Toowoomba. That person whose life choices may have been shut off because of the way in which we value human capital and the way in which we include everybody in society in really important conversations. And things, these are areas that we should be improving. So I was frustrated with myself, frustrated with the world, frustrated with the processes we'd gone through in the pandemic. And I just decided to put the last 6 years of all the professional speaking research I'd ever done on any of these topics and just try and write a book. And I wrote it in 18 nights, but it took me 9 months to find a publisher.
We talked about the fact that a lot has changed since the book is written, and that's where we want to spend our time tonight. Because in the book you talk about the role of Facebook. Well, it became Meta.
I predicted it was going to rename itself Metaverse, so I was halfway right. And of course, when they changed themselves to Meta, I had to take that out of the book because I was obviously late.
And when you think about Facebook and the social license to operate, which is a term that always sat really uncomfortably with me until most recently when they launched Threads, and everyone was asking me whether I was now, because Twitter was no longer the marketplace of ideas, whether I was going to cut across to Threads. And I found myself stopping and thinking about the fact that I couldn't trust Mark Zuckerberg, and therefore there was no way I was going to begin an account on Threads, no matter how popular it was, simply because I'd been let down by him on so many occasions. In fact, lots of us had. Not in small ways, in significant ways. And you know the story of Cambridge Analytica, you know the story of the disinformation and the misinformation that took place in the election in the United States, which leads us to another change since the book, and that is the impact on social media by state actors to prey on the ignorance of those who don't know any better, and the consequential impact with the rise of Trump. That role of technology is quite significant, and it's not something that is easily understood.
The most dangerous aspect of artificial intelligence this year and next year, particularly in the US, is disinformation and extremification of political points of view. It's always been an issue that you could always find your own echo chamber. When we talked about social media as very much an echo chamber, we like to hear our own voices back. We like to be affirmed of what we believe is true. But the problem now, even YouTube has been monitored for this. I think they took a young man that went looking for a certain type of video. It took 8 videos of automatically playing before he got to extremist right-wing political material. 8 videos before he ended up there. Now, this is before anyone actually starts an active disinformation campaign. And there was a really interesting piece of research that was done about a month ago, where a couple of researchers in the US decided they would create a disinformation campaign for the Trump-Biden 2024 election run. Okay, and so what they decided to do was use AI to actually just go for it, just unleash it. It lasted 8 hours before they had to switch it off because it was already causing such a fracas. It was already generating imagery and generating stories that were seemingly so real that this is dangerous. Now, we've got another, I think we still have the ability to comment on the federal government's AI response paper. I think it finishes this week. One of my big hopes for that is that we are going to ban deepfakes. Deepfakes, for me, are probably the largest threat to our civil liberty than we've ever seen come out of any social media. Because unless you label something, or recognize something, or contest something as whether or not it's fake, you are going to get images of things that are so horrific and so politicizing. And so when there was the fake imagery of Trump being arrested in New York and people were putting it on LinkedIn, people thought it was real. Even in the posts, they said, this is an AI-generated image. It is not real. It is fake. In the comments, people thought it was real because people see what they want to see and they read what they want to read. And so, unfortunately, regulation has not kept up with this new convergent capability of mass dissemination of fake information, even when it says it's fake. I tried to scratch the surface here by writing a book which seems very old school, but I wanted to see how the system worked. As a cybernetician, I wanted to just test and check the system. How do we get these conversations started? How can I get people looking at this in a different way? How can we throw historical constructs at this that we all know, understand, and believe to be true on technology that we don't know, understand, or believe to be true? And we have to look back so that we can plan forwards. But banning deepfakes, for me, is the absolute minimum we should be doing out of our responsible AI projects here in Australia.
Which takes us to earlier this year, where Satya Nadella launches ChatGPT, which is the 3 at the World Economic Forum. And the share price lights up and the world lights up. Did he know what he was doing? Did he do it on purpose? Did he do it willing to take the risk? And where has he left us?
Now, before you look at what he did with, you know where I'm going with this, Maria, because you've heard me talk about it before. Just stay with me for a moment as I talk to you about the systems approach to what Microsoft have been doing, because it is actually genius. And as a futurist, one of the things we look at are the signals and the tweaks that what some of these large companies that have a lot more brains than I have are looking at how they're going to be growing and future readiness inside their business. I don't like the term future-proofing. The future is definitely coming. We can't proof ourselves against it. We have to be ready for it. And so Microsoft, a few years ago, bought a company called Minecraft. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a little software game that kids play on their iPads or something. They bought that when it was at about 600 or 700 users. I think it was certainly less than 1,000 users. You go, why would Microsoft buy a little kids game? Why would they do that? Well, that's very interesting. Okay, let's put that to one side. Microsoft buy 49% of OpenAI, which are the most sophisticated chatbots that you could possibly access. This is the rise now of the synthverse. The synthverse is where the metaverse meets artificial intelligence. So you've got your representation, you've got Microsoft's representation in terms of Minecraft, and then you've got autonomous agents, chatbots. They're going to be interacting with you to, like I did by writing this book, test you and work out, what do you like, what do you not like, what do you want to talk about, what do you want to ask about. And so Microsoft bought OpenAI, and you go, well, this is really interesting. Then Minecraft start a series of really beautiful relationships with companies like Gucci. So you go, hang on a second here. Big tech company, owns a software thing that's aimed at teenagers primarily, now in a partnership with a really expensive premium fashion brand. What is happening here? What is happening here is the start of the transition between Web 2 and Web 3. Digital shopping and avatar identification of how we play and live and work in virtual worlds is not going to be for us, it's going to be for my 3-year-old and 5-year-old. So what happens is they're playing on Minecraft, they go to the Gucci store, they buy their digital Gucci shoes for their little avatar that's playing around on this virtual world. When they're 16, what do they want for their birthday? Mummy, I want my Gucci trainers. Well, when they get their Gucci trainers, knowing me, they probably would. When they get their Gucci trainers, they also get a digital copy. So now you go shopping anywhere. Someone I think paid $700,000 for the Sydney Opera House virtual world. Okay, so there's real money going into these digital assets. So back to the Microsoft thing, you go, well, this is all very interesting. So what could this possibly mean? Microsoft want to be able to target services and personalize everything. And absolutely that makes sense. We want to have a very smooth operation between, anyone ever had an argument with Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel? Yeah. Anyone actually had any formalized training in any Microsoft packages before we actually used them? Like, the day I figured out what the $sign did in an Excel spreadsheet was like a hallelujah moment during my PhD. Learning how to touch type and speed type. You know, when I wrote this book, I did part of it voice to text. I didn't even actually type it. This is before ChatGPT, right? So now if I was to write this book, would I put that through an editorial suite before I sent it to my editors? Possibly. Would I ask it to write it? Absolutely not, because ChatGPT is so vanilla, it doesn't come out with anything original particularly. Yet. And so my final thing about Microsoft is if you just start peeling back the layers of the onions, this is not a 12-month or 18-month plan. They have been watching for an open AI platform for a very long time. They've been waiting for it. They tried to do a search engine, it failed. They've been watching Google, they can't acquire them. So they're looking for these people where the future is peeking through. The future just peeks through with some of these things, and they try and catch it early. We can't probably list all the failures that Microsoft has invested in because we don't hear about them. We only hear about the successes. My next thing about Microsoft, though, that really got me excited was they've recently invested in nuclear fusion. So they're actually investing in a startup that thinks they'll have a commercial-grade nuclear fusion reactor by 2028. So why would Microsoft need free energy? Well, we know that at least 25% of the global carbon footprint is going to be from data storage alone. So if you want to class yourself as a climate change agent, you know, we want to fight climate change, we're a carbon neutral or a carbon negative company, you invest in nuclear fusion or renewable energy. Sorry, so that's my Microsoft rant. Really interesting company to watch, and watch it on the fringes. Watch what it does that doesn't work. It's a really interesting beast as a bit of a barometer as to how the rest of Silicon Valley is playing. And you've got to remember how much Bill Gates saved Apple. Everyone forgets this. Steve Jobs was in real trouble. So, you know, Microsoft basically owns Apple too, when you think about it.
And that's before we even start to talk about Bard. So what's interesting...
I can't wait to get my hands on Bard. Like, I've got to get to
amazing.
the UK just to try it. Like, can't try it here yet.
What's interesting is, of course, it was the researchers out of Google that were disenfranchised that went to Microsoft on the OpenAI platform. So in terms of... We haven't even touched on... in these early stages with ChatGPT, the hallucinations that it has, and also, you talked about it earlier, the misinformation opportunities, the disinformation opportunities. The other thing that's happened, of course, is we're in a war in the Ukraine. And in that environment, they're testing many of the drones, they're testing many of the technologies that have been developed. Yeah. You're the founder of the World of Drones. Talk to me about that. Explain a little bit about where that came from and what the consequences are, both in Australia and what you've seen in the war zone.
It's really interesting because the Ukraine conflict has kind of evolved into a weaponry test bed. You all feeling that? Like, we're going to provide all of this stuff to the Ukraine. Look at all this wonderful test data we're getting back. Starlink, we're going to give all of these to the Ukrainians. But when you go into Bakhmut or one of the towns, because it's still potentially Russian-held, we won't switch those on until it's too late. You know, there's a really interesting thing of, you know, can we not just stop Russia being in Ukraine rather than just playing with these people's lives, giving them our toys to play with? I find it a little bit distasteful. But the drone warfare aspect is something I do talk about in my book. The future of war, for me, is the most difficult chapter for me to write because it's an area that's so contentious and I sit on the edges of. None of the drone work I've ever done has been militarised. It's always been, some of the aircraft are sub-military grades. They'll be ITAR restricted, the International Trade in Arms Regulation, ITAR restricted because of maybe something in the SATCOMs or something in the transponder or something like that. We used them back in 2012, 2013 to do long-range missions off of the Pilbara to look for new species, to look at coastal erosion, to look at turtle tracks, to identify turtle nests, to identify where the turtles were, where the coral reefs were, and things like that. And we used Aerosonde, which was a Melbourne company, which had always been really successful in weather monitoring. And Aerosonde, actually, they flew in 1998 from Canada to Scotland on 7 litres of petrol. I mean, their drones are really great long-range aircraft that can carry a multitude of payloads, and the payloads are shrinking so you can carry more. And if you understand the ecological windows of the animals or the ecosystems that you're surveying, you can get some really beautiful data. And I remember taking this picture of a wonderful oceanic manta ray that we'd picked up, and I'd never seen one of these things before. And that thing would fill this room. I mean, they're pretty huge. And I took it to a fisheries expert at UWA, and he said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "Oh, it's here, it's GPS." And he went, "Catherine, we've not seen one of those up there for 30 years. And I'm like, "That's because you're in boats, Ewan. They don't like the noise. We're flying at 120 metres in something with a 3-metre wingspan that doesn't fit any predator-prey models. We're not having that non-predatory predation aspect. We're not causing that fear. We're not interacting. We're doing what David Attenborough loves people for." And I'd love to have given David Attenborough this data set. We are looking through Mother Nature's, porthole, and she doesn't know that we're there. And that non-sampling bias was magic to me. And of course, my imposter syndrome, when we'd done that first survey, I was like, well, I can't be the first to have done this. Other people must be doing this, and I've just copied someone by accident. I must have read it somewhere or heard about it on the radio. You know when you doubt yourself? No, we were the first to do it. And I was like, this is kind of obvious. Why is there a gap with some of these technologies that have been around since the 90s, and there's a gap between capability and action? Why? What is that? Is it funding? Is it identification of a problem? Is it the will to try to do it differently? And the way we came up against it in WA was that the ministerial conditions for these particular projects actually had methodology written in. You will use a manned aircraft to do your coastal surveys. I'm like, well, then what the hell are we trying to even innovate here if we're not even going to be able to use this data for the government reporting? So you come up against the politics of it. So after being in the drone industry for a number of years, I worked out that we weren't accelerating the diversity and the potential of these technologies. I worked out that in Australia, we really were kicking goals in ways that other countries just wished that they could. We were so far ahead of the Americans, we were so far ahead of the British, that they were coming to Australia to test their aircraft, to test the regulation piece, to test their communications. And so I was like, well, we've got a head start, so we should probably use it. So I created World of Drones Congress to actually have a congress, a forum, where we got together everybody who might be wanting to use one of these things, from the mining industry to the surf lifesavers to the Queensland government to the federal government, to anybody who might want to use drones for something, be it a drone that size, be it a drone an Aerosonde size, and just talk to each other about regulation, insurance, assurance, business uses, opportunities. And it had never been done before. And my largest success, I think, out of that first conference was actually a drone cybersecurity company, an Australian drone cybersecurity company that's going gangbusters now. But at the time, he wasn't sure he wanted to continue because every drone conference in the world didn't want him on stage because he talked about how drones could get hacked. And they didn't want to hear about how drones could get hacked. They were trying to sell drones. They don't want to show the weakness of drones. Well, being a company director myself, I know that you can't risk assess a methodology unless you show me the weakest link. And so I gave him not only the microphone and the stage, but the opening part of the session. And he said the 2 or 3 clients that he got, that was the turning point for his business. And that is the gap between government, academia, entrepreneurship, and business. In that we don't need more grants, we need work. Because people are ready to start working. And so that was my World of Drones story.
You talked about the hack and the importance of the hack. We have legacy systems across government, and many enterprises that cause significant issues because they're expensive to protect. It's cheaper for us to be able to build new systems than it is to retrofit cybersecurity onto the older systems, which makes us vulnerable to state actors that want to do us harm. And it's a problem across the world. The cybersecurity elements of the world that you operate, the exposures, the weaknesses are constant, whether it's in technology that is established or the new technology with the rush to get the technology out the door. India's suffering from it at the moment with the Aadhaar, with their universal payments platform. 40% of the time, those platforms are down because they didn't build cybersecurity into them. So what's the predilection? What can we expect to see in the cyber world?
We, I think, as a nation, went onto a war footing 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and it didn't really make any headlines. And I find that a little disconcerting, totally typical. Sorry, I do have a tickle in my throat, which is going to kick off. Yes, please. This is called All Work and No Play Makes Catherine Cough during a presentation. Cybersecurity is our weakest link. If we don't have cybersecure systems, everything is for naught. When we look at what happened with Sony after their big cyber attack, after they made that really funny film about North Korea, didn't go down so well with the North Koreans, people went to the stationery cupboard and the stationery cupboard was bare. There were no pens or paper, and so there was no way to keep operating. When we look at how quantum computing is now working, and we look at how AI, quantum, and cyber are going to form this triumvirate, we're in real trouble if we're not first. If we lose this Cold War for quantum, if we lose the efforts against the cyber attacks, we're going to look at a post-internet world. Is anyone ready for a post-internet world? I think a few people might be. But imagine that our entire financial systems switched off overnight. It would be worse than the global financial crisis. Just even one bank taken out. And so we're just waiting for it. We're waiting for the next big one. You know, we talk about pandemics, we talk about various things that can go wrong, polycrises, multi-crises. I was very heartened by the fact that the first thing we did to help the Ukrainians was prevent the Russian cyber attacks. And in my book, I talk about warfare. The next warfare is cyber and information and disinformation warfare. And so cyber attacks are the first sign that any kind of attack will be coming in. And I'm very worried about it. The thing that frustrates me most, though, is that I'm constantly seeing people either on LinkedIn or Instagram, and they're educated people, going, oh, I've got my account hacked. Sorry, someone hacked my account. And I'm like, multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication has been around for such a long time now. If you're not verifying your apps and you're not verifying things through the devices that you're on already, we're in a real problem here. And still the majority of cyber issues are human issues. They're not actually technological issues. They are people clicking on the wrong links. They are people in Australia. This isn't coming in from outside. This is inside Australia running cyber attack fraudulent schemes against people. One thing I might ask you all to consider. In your family, you need to have a safe word. One of the biggest things that we're facing now are deep fake audio scams. So people get a phone call from a loved one saying, help mum, I've been in a car crash. I need you to send some money to this person who's helping me move the car. And there was a couple of instances of this where there was a fake kidnapping and there was a girl screaming in the background, crying for her mother on the phone, and her mother was in distress, and the guy was like, I'm going to kill your daughter unless you give me this money. And meanwhile, the mother's freaking out downstairs, and the next minute the girl calls down and goes, Mum, who are you on the phone to? Anyone who's got any audio anywhere on the internet, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, I certainly do, people can take your voice and create a deep fake audio copy of it. So should that ever happen to your family, the first thing you say is, what's the word? What's the word? Because then you know whether or not it's real or not. We have to build in safety measures to protect us all against this. The attacks are domestic, they are not foreign, and they're getting more sophisticated. And the thing is, they're working, they're making so much money. They're making so much money. Because if they weren't working, they wouldn't try it, they would try something else.
And it's interesting, the company that I work with is cyber secure. I mean, we secure the we modernise and we manage the mission-critical systems for the world, for governments and for large enterprises. And the other day I laughed that our systems were so secure, it was like a Wang system. You know, I couldn't use the laptop to do anything because they'd made it so secure I wasn't able to transfer things, I wasn't able to do anything. And I think what's really fascinating in the world of cybersecurity, particularly when it comes to defence, for example, the Defence Strategic Review that was recently released, submissions were made, and you will have read the report that was out there. Often what happens with defence is that investments are made by government and the money goes to kit rather than to the ICT back end that protects and supports those systems. And at some point that balance has to change, because without the systems to support the analysis of the volumes of data that are collected and the protection of the volumes of the data that are collected, we don't get decision superiority. Without decision superiority, we can't fight a war in the way that new wars will be fought. And what's interesting is that's on the defence side. We have the similar problems in the private sector.
Do you know what the future of all that, though, is? We are moving between Industry 4.0 to Industry 5.0. So we're going from the Internet of Things to the Internet of Bodies. So your password is no longer going to be your password. It's how you type your password. All of us have a certain flair with how we put the keywords in and how we type. It will be your retinal scan. It's no longer going to be your fingerprint, because that's quite easily copied. It will be a device that's actually maybe even directly into your bloodstream. You know how you get those blood sugar monitors? Imagine now that blood sugar monitor is also verifying that that's you by either a micro-DNA test or some kind of kit we haven't even heard of yet. They are all coming. That we will actually be using our biology to verify who we are, because we can't. We'll get to the point where we can't keep doing all the different kinds of authentication and proving. And so that's the Internet of Bodies. Something that is in my book that I found very interesting was there's a laser that was developed, laser vibrometry. And what they do is they aim a laser at a person and you can pick up the pulse. And your pulse is as unique as your fingerprint, right? So up to 200 meters, this thing was called Jetson, and you could literally pick up anyone in the room and identify you based on your pulse. Now, imagine that laser vibrometry is actually in your device, so when you pick up your device, it picks up the pulse and verifies it's you. Imagine that when it scans your face, it actually picks up a vein, works out your pulse, and it knows it's you. We're getting to the point now where in Beijing, you go on the trains, it's your palm print, and you're through. We've got vending machines that use your face. We've got shops that you don't even need to pay anything for. It recognises you as you walk in, knows what you put in your shopping bags, and knows what you'll eat, especially if you test it and try and shove something up your jumper. It knows what that is too. And so we've got this way now going forwards where identification is going to be not multifactorial, it's going to be biological, and it will be based on one of these systems that will be proven or truth. But the problem is, who owns that data? Who are we giving that third-party information to? And will it be something as complex as using our genome to identify who we are? Are we willing to give our genome over to Zuckerberg to do your Facebook login?
So this is interesting, because now we're talking about the responsibility of these companies, the winner-take-all attitude that created Musk's enterprise, the winner-take-all attitude that created Zuckerberg's enterprise. What should we be thinking about in terms of their responsibility? What should we be thinking about in terms of regulation? How do we tax these organisations? These are all conversations that are live right now. You saw the Senate inquiry into AI just recently. So, you know, what should we be factoring in?
Oh, it would be great if some of them paid tax in Australia, wouldn't it? Just putting that out there. I think you should pay tax domestically where you operate. Sorry, it's like anyone. Like, you should pay tax domestically where you operate. Sorry, I do. I pay tax. I'm quite happy to. I'm a socialist. If me paying tax means kids get to go to school, we have beautiful libraries like this, and we have opportunities to have great lives, tax me. That's my thing, right? But I guess I come from a different place than others. You've got to remember how some of these systems started, though, and this is what I talk about a lot when we think about even cybernetics and the role of cybernetics since World War II. If you imagine that Facebook really started as a dating opportunity for socially awkward young men on a university campus to work out who was single and who wasn't. I don't think when they first put that together, they realised what they were going to do in 2016. I don't think they even really thought of it, because that wasn't the reason why it was started. It's not the reason why it existed. So if you try to regulate the platform back there, the time that regulation takes, by the time you regulate it, you're regulating a dinosaur. So we talk about things in drone years. You know, drone years is like 1 year is like 10 years. So it was 10 years ago I was flying these drones in WA. The technology and the communications capability, the speed, the diversity, the payload opportunities on drones now is 100 years different than when you look at the automobile, you look at the way cars have gone. They have changed less in 100 years than drones have changed in 10. And so if we look at the acceleration of how these software companies are evolving, can we ever regulate, can we ever change the tires on a car that is moving? Now, I am not a proponent on this idea of stopping AI research for 6 months. I never was. Because the thing is, who's stopping for 6 months? Nefarious actors won't be stopping for 6 months. And it's one of these things of, unless we're first, it's this machination again of, are we second? And does that mean that we've lost something? So for me, when we look at some of the overarching regulation that already exists, we can take some hope from some of that. Human Rights Act has a wonderful clause in it called the Martens Clause, and it was written basically as a catch-all to collect everything that we weren't quite sure how to regulate yet. And it comes down to this central question: is this good for humanity or bad for humanity? Because if it's bad for humanity, we probably shouldn't do it. Now, the problem is, Facebook, when they started it, is it good for humanity or is it bad for humanity? Because we had no idea how Facebook was going to evolve in the last 10 years. We had no idea how AI was going to evolve in the last 10 years, except some of us did. It's just that it wasn't scaled. Right? The future was peeking through again. And it's only when it became a nice, easy thing for you to do on your phone that everyone suddenly got it. By the end of this year, you will have a large language model-enabled search engine on all of your devices. When you talk to Siri, Alexa, when you go to Google, when you do any kind of search, using any of them, they will all have AI built into that now in a way that they've never had beforehand. And so how do you regulate something that's going at the speed of a cheetah when the regulator is going at the speed of a turtle?
Well, I guess it has to do with education.
Tortoise, sorry.
It would have to do with education. It would have to do with reskilling. It would have to do with making sure that those with the hands on those levers are aware. And I guess that comes back to the conversations that are being had around universities at the moment. What is their role when it comes to this part of the economy? We're not talking about life and death in the sense that you're educating a doctor or you're educating anyone, any of those vocations. Much of this education is hands-on. It's created. It doesn't need to be done at universities. It's done in workshops. So how do we not only accelerate that knowledge creation, how do we then promulgate it across government, across business, so that those who do have their levers on the decision-making, those who do control the decision-making, are able to keep up, or at least not be too far behind?
I have to say that they just need to start acting like futurists. So, and I don't mean that in any other sense, that we need to get better at being prescient about where these things are going to go. And like Microsoft will take bets that sometimes don't work, we need to start taking bets on what we think's coming and how we need to regulate it. We need to have a faster response system built in to legislation with brakes, levers, pauses. We need to join up with our allies to actually work this, and it could be that our existing defence alliances like AUKUS and Quad are a really good way to do that. Quad, for me, is probably the most exciting defence alliance that Australia's been in, because it encapsulates our great friend to the north, Japan, and it encapsulates the biggest country in the world, most populous country in the world, India, which is also now going to be the next big thing for Australia, quite frankly. And if we can get some alliances and build technologies that are aiming to not only curb the enthusiasm, some might say, of some of these big tech companies, but actually create economic opportunities for our software industries and our brains in this country. Universities have a very diverse and sophisticated reason for being. And it's not just about pumping out graduates. And the thing that bothers me, and again, it was stuff coming out of the UK where they're going to defund unnecessary degrees. They don't seem to realise what it means to have a university thought process, interaction, social interaction, and where those places should maybe be less ivory tower and maybe be more accessible, and maybe universities do need to check themselves as to whether they are actually open and engaging their communities in ways that they should be. But universities have a very important role to play. My big call, if I was to make anything, in fact, can I just have 2 wishes if I was Prime Minister for the day, Maria?
Go ahead.
So the first thing I would do is I would ban all under 18s from accessing social media. Blanket ban. Under 18s, not allowed. We don't let them smoke cigarettes and we don't let them drink alcohol. Why the heck are we letting them reorganize their brains through social media? Why are we doing that? My second thing would be I would take our percentage GDP into R&D up to about 10%. If you took our percentage GDP to 10%, this country would be one of the most powerful countries in the world, one of the most influential, and we would be already winning the quantum game. We would be already winning the AI game, and we would be the ones creating Microsoft AI, Open AI. And the Atlassian chaps wouldn't have had to leave to go and exist. They would be here. They would have started here. Culturally, it would have ingrained. I get very passionate about the idea of us celebrating science the way we celebrate sports. And you can tell by my accent that I'm a new Australian, but that doesn't mean that I'm not passionate. My boys were born here. My future is Australian. And I look at how we could do so much more, and our universities are absolutely part and parcel of that going forwards.
I think we'll open it up for questions at this point.
Sorry, just care a little bit about that.
Not at all. It's actually something really important to care about. Today, there was the announcement that on the Harvard Economic Complexity Index, we've fallen to 93. We were 55 in 1995. And when you look at the curve for exports of fossil fuels, where our curve goes this way, as 40% of our exports go to our northern neighbours, the economic complexity of the country goes this way. And it's because we've relied so heavily on them for our income, and we haven't invested in our advanced manufacturing. And as Catherine says, it's not beyond us, because we've seen it. Now, having said that, I would like to open to questions from the floor if there are any. If you could start with your name and where you're from.
Certainly. Guy Lokes, a member of the Royal Society of New South Wales. I'll set aside the general architecture and the narrow AI, LLM models that we're talking, Siri autocorrect on steroids. We need to evolve the discussion, and your statement on the people was very, very important. Why would I surrender my biometric AI data to someone? I love my RSA token. Go at it, have at it, Bard. So the decisions, how do we evolve those discussions?
We need to start talking, and it's interesting because when you and I first started talking about tonight, that economic measure hadn't yet come out, and it was an Innovation Oz that I sent you that link, and then there was the follow-up in the AFR. I haven't seen that on a single headline on the news. So, we're not talking about the right things around the water cooler. We're not talking about the right things. We have a real lack of capability to disseminate, and this isn't about #SciComm. This is actually about what do we want Australia to be? What do we want our lives to look like in the future? And I don't know what it is that we need to do other than we need to talk about this more, and we need to talk about it on every platform we can. Podcasts, webinars, seminars, cartoons, things aimed at kids, things aimed at young adults, things aimed at the 50-plus, things aimed at 40-year-olds. I mean, I'm a Zennial, darling, so I was 79, so I would class myself as Gen X. But we will be succumbing, and we are already succumbing biometric information. If you've had a passport that you've had in the last sort of 2 years, that is a biometric passport. So we are already giving over biological information in the infrastructure that we use to maintain our life as business as usual and our life as normal. Some might say, what's the difference between your palm print and like a blood sample? And I'm like, well, talk to the family of Henrietta Lacks, who just today have actually settled with the pharmaceutical agreement around the HeLa cell lines for an undisclosed amount of money. If people aren't familiar with what happened to Henrietta Lacks, please get the book, watch the movie, learn about her, because without her, we wouldn't have half of the cancer treatments I think we have today. She was a unique and beautiful individual who was taken horribly advantage of. And so that was done to her because she was a woman of colour in the US in the 50s, right, or the 60s, whenever it was they took those cells from her. And so we look at the ways that we right the wrongs of how people's bodily privacy is abused. People were a bit funny about digitization of medical records. Well, what do people think they're giving over when they have a TikTok channel? When we have gait analysis now that can take video footage and work out within statistical significance of whether or not someone has a neurodegenerative disease or not. So when you're giving out all this biological information about your children and yourself on a dance platform that's owned by a foreign country, what do you think you're giving over? So like, if I walked up to you in the street and I said, Maria, we never met before, of course. Maria, what's your middle name? What was your mother's maiden name? What did you have for lunch? Show me a photograph. You know, what's your favourite place to visit? What's your favourite type of wine? You'd look at me like I was a moron. But a lot of people hand this stuff willingly over on an almost hourly basis. We're now getting to the stage where we actually touch our devices more than we physically touch the people that we love. That, for me, we have to talk to people more. And I'm not just talking about kids in school here. I'm talking the analogue knowledge that we have in the 50+ is being lost in this idea of digital transformation. It frustrates me greatly. We will be giving over biological information to access services because people want to access services, and so they will give it over. People will give blood samples so they can be the first to access a certain social media platform. People will literally give of themselves. Watch it happen. It's like drug addiction. And so how do we regulate that? Regulation is the sledgehammer. We need education before we have regulation. It comes down to personal moral choice, but I mean, this is us expecting humans to do logical things, which I don't know if has ever really happened. Has anyone ever documented that?
Hi, my name's Renee Ryan. I'm from the University of Sydney and I'm a researcher. So I would vote for you if you wanted to increase our R&D spend to 10%, because it's shameful, really, Australia's R&D spend. If you look at us compared to the OECD countries and really the rest of the world, it's shockingly small. And neither government is really doing anything about it. It's been bad for a long time, but it's not really shifting. And so I suppose my question to you, as someone who accesses R&D funds and we can see the benefit of it, how do we convince, I suppose, broader society and our governments that it is important and you do get huge return on investment in R&D?
Again, has your research ever been on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald?
No.
No. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be, right? We do amazing work in this country. It's never celebrated or talked about in a way that the average Australian will see it. And so we have a real problem. And this is about communicating to the community. I think we need to bring the community in. We need to bring the communities into universities. We need to look at new ways to get every single person that lives in Australia visiting a university campus, visiting a research lab in the next 12 months. Would that seem impossible? I don't think so, if we really wanted to do it. And this isn't about graduate recruitment. This is actually about look at what we are achieving, look at what we are doing. And look, we're great every now and then when the Australian of the Year is a scientist. We get a little bit of a science bump, right? When something goes hideously wrong and a scientist does something like the Doherty Institute, sequencing the COVID genome, a little bit of a bump there because it meant... yeah, yes, this is it. There's a real problem around that. So the thing is, the people that do the best GDP, is ironic, because we talk about what's the correlation and causation. So the ones, I think it's South Korea and Israel are the highest, and they're nearly 6%. I think we're below 2%. But they are both countries that are constantly at war with everybody around them. So what's driving their R&D isn't the need for a better society to spend more money on R&D. It's let's develop better weapons. Let's develop better science and knowledge about the next kind of bomb we want to use or the next kind of cybersecurity thing we want to use. And so you need to break up research not only into the research that defense-driven economies might do, but actually look at it as a whole across society. I would like to see levies and taxes seriously put on some of the large multinationals that operate in this country. When we worked out, I think one year, I paid more tax than Google did in Australia because it's based out of Ireland and there's a weird tax loop, and I'm sorry if I've got that wrong, but that was my understanding of it. And so who's going to fund it? If they said, well, who's going to fund this? But then you look at things like the Queensland government had a few extra billion came in from coal exports that they weren't expecting. Now, what could you have done with that? What could you have done with that? But what they did was, because it's them, and I understand why they did it, cost of living crisis and everything, they gave everyone in Queensland a couple of grand to go against the cost of living crisis. And so there's a balance between what it costs to do research and what it costs to do social work. But I just don't see anything bad to come out of putting more money into research, though also the waste that happens inside large institutions is always very interesting. And a really great model around that is going to be over the next few years as academics as well and people interested in the higher education sector. Let's watch what happens in Adelaide. Because they're combining Uni SA and Uni Adelaide into a super university. So when we talk about cutting the fat, cutting all the extra weight out of how some of these large organisations work, that's going to be a real time. Someone's going to be doing some PhDs off of that, surely, right, in terms of saving the money. But people will only pay for things they care about. They'll only pay for things that they think are worth doing. And unfortunately, it seems current and previous political cycles don't seem to understand that if we want a more diverse economic profile, we need more money going into R&D because we're not Israel, we're not South Korea, we are Australia. Very different.
I also think it's a problem for the marketers. I think the marketers haven't discovered the researchers. Because if you think about what Main Sequence are doing, so the CSIRO put $100 million into the first fund, and there are now 2 funds. They've now invested $1 billion. And off the back of that, you've got companies like Q-Control that are driving quantum. You've got FleetSpace. You've got Myriota out of Adelaide. Some fantastic companies that are world-beating. But it took people like Bill Barty and Mike Nichols to go into universities to find the research, to find founders, researchers who could become founders. And then
that's not easy.
Which is hard, but there was the ON program that enabled it, and then to back them in. So you had a VC that was government supported with private sector funds that was that had an investment thesis that was quite clear: deep tech, long term, big bets, and it's starting to work. But it took that marketing mentality. It took the mentality of, okay, there is some research in universities that can't be commercialised, but it contributes to something else. But there's a heck of a lot of research that can be. So why isn't that dialogue happening?
Hang on, wait for the microphone so people online can hear you. People online. Or wherever. Yeah.
What you've missed completely is economy of scale. Now, 85% of the world's solar cells are made in China, and they're made on the basis of research that was done at the University of New South Wales. Now, could Australia... The thing the Chinese did was the thing the Germans had done 20 years before. They invested a large sum of money in making the solar cells in 10 times the volume that anybody else did. That was exactly what Germany had done before, so China had to invest at least 10 times as much money to get that far. But a country of 27 million people is never going to have the mass market to support that kind of investment.
You're absolutely right, but we're a great test bed for the rest of the world. We have one of the most diverse populations. Israel only has 8 million people, and yet they serve the rest of the world. It is literally, if you accept that your market is overseas and you structure yourself to be able to either... the one problem we have is that many of the companies are now incorporating in Delaware because that's where the funding is coming from and access to those markets. But there are companies that have managed to do it from here. That's the conundrum. It's not necessarily for our market, it's for the markets we can serve. But it's possible.
We probably actually need to think a lot more internationally than just Australia.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more.
There was a really interesting article that backs up a lot we just discussed then. It was a study, it was organised by Cambridge University, so we have to just put that they funded this particular piece of research. But they worked out that technology park that they built at Cambridge University is worth more to the British economy than the English Premier League. When you think about the English Premier League, how many English people own clubs in the English Premier League? Any? There's like a Canadian actor and someone else owns Wrexham, right? I see that a bit on the... But it's big money, right? It's Middle East money, it's big American billionaire money, it's, you know, all these kinds of people, but it's still the English Premier League. So what is it that some of these analogous industries are doing? But the point was that the Cambridge Technology Park was bringing in more money to the British economy. One university, one technology park, more than the whole Premier League. But how many people in the UK support the Premier League, and how many people in the UK go to Cambridge University? And so we've got a whole suite of conversations we can have around analogous transformation and ways in which we can incite the populace. Can you imagine if every university had one of those technology parks? Yeah. Yep, we've got a huge diaspora here of talented individuals in Australia as well. But yes, this is the point. We have to think about these things differently, and I don't think we are. I think we're not. I think we're seeing the macro.
Could I pick up that point?
Please do.
First, thank you so much for your presentation and the conversation. My brain hurts sitting here, and I'm not sure there's any way out of it. One of the things, my name's Oliver Freeman, I'm a futurist, and one of the things that I've become interested in recently is the language we use to describe situations where we actually want to intervene and make change. If you take by way of example the whole idea of inflation, I can tell you the problem with inflation is that it doesn't exist. It's an abstraction put together by macroeconomists. They think it's beautiful. They think they can use the whole idea of inflation to regulate our lives in terms of interest rates and so on. But it's actually basically bullshit. It doesn't exist. You can't touch it. You can't kiss it. You can't take it home with you. You can't do anything. Now, in the conversation that we've been having, Catherine, particularly, I have an issue about artificial intelligence. I only have two issues with artificial intelligence. The first is the word artificial, and the second is the word intelligence. And I think that we are actually being led down pathways that may not be that productive because we fail to really capture what it is that we're dealing with. Now, it may be that artificial intelligence would be better described as automated construction. I don't know. There must be other ways of describing the process so that it's much more specific and actually provides us with a platform for intervention. The way it is at the moment, I find it very, very difficult to see how we can intervene, both at the regulatory level, whatever level you like. And I think that we need to think a little bit more now about the metaphysics of the language that we use to describe the problems that we think, as futurists, might be coming up.
I couldn't agree more. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, right? Wouldn't it? I have a big problem with the term artificial intelligence. It was cooked up round the table by a bunch of blokes that were trying to understand what it was and how to describe machine learning effectively, and algorithms that could guess or bet on what they think the answer might be. When we talk about AI having hallucinations, it makes me laugh because it makes us think that there's actually something in there that it's thinking about. It's not. It's a betting machine. It's a roulette wheel. It's a Monte Carlo analysis. But it's really multi-layered, multimodal, and its neural networks are set up in a way that it has to try and find different potential iterations of everything, and then it's testing us. It's testing us. So a friend of mine's got an AI startup that's going to be amazing that's coming out of Brisbane, and I can't say much more than that, but I'll let you all know when they do the Sydney launch because we need to be there. But one of the things that they were talking to Microsoft about, which I can probably mention, was that instead of basically asking people to write better prompts, my friend said, let's flip this. What we need to do is actually get the AI or the program to actually ask better things of the human being that's interacting with it. Because at the moment, we're just pouring things into it. We're not actually being asked anything by it in a way that's any kind of meaningful interaction. And one of the things we do know about OpenAI is the human labor costs behind how they're actually training these models. There are people being paid pittances sitting there training these language models up. There are humans involved in ChatGPT. Everyone seems to think it's this ethereal thing. Like, I seriously had somebody once who was an incredibly intelligent person, incredibly well-educated, high up in the corporate field, had been an academic, and he sort of turned to me and said to me, well, the cloud, the cloud. That's just where the data's just in the air, isn't it? And then you just pull the data down when you need it. He didn't realise that the cloud, the computing cloud, was actually somebody else's server, and you were just accessing it through Wi-Fi or something. That again came from public research in astrophysics, right? Wi-Fi, great Australia. The amount of Americans, when I tell them that Australia invented Wi-Fi, they don't believe me. They have to go and Google it. I'm like, this should be like a point of national celebration. So artificial intelligence for me, unfortunately, always also, people like to grab onto the words that they can kind of understand to make them sound kind of intelligent when they're trying to have a conversation about it. And so artificial stupidity, or artificial number crunching, or computer-based, problem solving, or, mathematics, how to scare most people. You just say the word, it's maths. What? They wouldn't be playing with it as much if they just thought it was just maths. And effectively, it's just maths. Effectively, it's just numbers trying to pull answers out of pots that are being trained by other human beings. And it's, say, has anyone actually ChatGPT'd themselves? It's very amusing. I'm apparently the CEO of something called Black Swan Data in the UK. I'm like, is this tool prescient? Am I talking to Sarah Connor? Is this Terminator? Is this Skynet? Is this where I am in the future? Is this telling me something I need to do? Is this the crystal ball that I need? We need to name the puppy, though. So if we're going to name it something, we have to name it something. But the problem is we're stuck with these historical languages around how we describe current and emerging technologies. And it's not helpful. And it's not normally from a place of diversity and inclusion either.
Thank you. One at the back and then one at the front.
Keith Suter, I work in the media. Brilliant presentation. Thank you. I want to get back to the whole question of communicating the importance of this subject to the general public. You're talking about putting it into the media, etc. The media don't operate that way. We respond to what we think our viewers and listeners want. So there's no way we can get this sort of stuff onto mainstream media. The general public are not interested, and if they are interested, they're very fatalistic. They're saying we're all doomed. They don't want to be depressed. They would much rather be watching females playing soccer. That's the challenge we've got. Now, Randy White wrote a great book called Don't Be Such a Scientist, which he came up with innovative ways of trying to communicate science. But it requires such a paradigm shift, because I give talks on this to scientific groups. It requires such a paradigm shift that the ordinary scientists would be horrified at doing it, and thus we're trapped in this situation. I'm sorry to be so depressed. It was a brilliant presentation.
You see, I find that people can be very stupid, but a person can be incredibly intelligent. So when you're looking at, what do the people want? Well, Henry Ford said, if you ask the people what they wanted, they'd say faster horses, right? So what does a person want? A person wants to be understood. A person wants to be respected, and they want to have their questions asked in a safe space. So one of the beauties of social media, and there are some, because without virtues there are no vices, and without vices there are no virtues, is the personalization of how people are going to be able to access information is changing. So rather than having to sit and watch whatever's on the television playing at the time with the 4 buttons that I had on my wooden pie television when I was growing up in the 80s, you can literally access information now. You can watch a Feynman lecture 1 minute. You can be watching The Big Bang Theory, quoting Feynman the next. There is a full cycle. That was a human. There's a whole paradigm shift in how we access information and data. So when people say, oh, what do people want to learn about? All I'm ever asked about, all I'm ever paid a large amount of money for by people is for me to tell them what is coming and what is happening. So I disagree entirely that people don't want to know what's coming. They absolutely want to know what's coming when you ask them as an individual. When you try and talk to a bunch of people, they get scared, or you're not sure, or there's something happening. All I know is every time I give a professional presentation, be it to a bunch of minors, be it to a bunch of private school educators, public school educators, politicians, learned academies, billionaires in San Francisco, whenever we talk about ideas, kids in Toowoomba, my home school, people that have never touched technology, the question is, what's coming? What do I need to know? What's coming? What's next? And so there is this problem with science communication and SciComm, and I think this is where it needs to be, this paradigm shift, and I agree it is a paradigm shift, but I refuse to give up. I refuse to give up. And I will keep going and speaking, and I will keep organising children's books, and I will keep funding conferences, and I will keep writing books, and I will keep having conversations until this room is empty. And every time I turn up, no one wants to hear from me anymore, because that is either everyone hates me and I've said something stupid, or my job is done. It's like, the best cardiovascular surgeons in the world want to be unemployed. They don't want to be cardiac specialists anymore. They don't want to be operating on people. And so I feel like I refuse to give up with this idea that the mass populace doesn't care about these things. When we next see a climate change march, how many of those people went to university and studied an environmental science degree? I'd say less than 1%, fewer than 1% probably. But all of them know that they care about what it is that they're learning about, and they want to know more, they want to be informed, and they want to be heard. And so that for me is the key about all of these technologies, is that everything is going to be it's already in their lives, it's already affecting their kids' future job prospects. The 80% of future jobs haven't even got titles on them yet. And so how do you allow someone's grandparent to give them the best advice if they come home from school and say, I want to be an artist, mummy? And mummy turns around and says, but darling, you need a job in STEM. There's no job in the arts. You're not going to be a starving artist. You need a STEM career. That's where when I wrote my book, what I'd hoped was that I'd given this person the knowledge that when their kid comes home and says, I want to be an artist, that they turn around and go, wow, did you know that Sir Peter Jackson sold Weta Workshop for 2.4 billion Australian dollars to an American games company? Because all people want are beautiful, immersive world experiences. Have you tried VR art? Have you tried being a 3D artist? Where can we get you a course? What would you like to try? Do you want to try a headset? Do you want to try virtual reality or mixed reality? No, love, sorry, that's not for you. And that's the difference, and I refuse to give up. And I want you to refuse to give up too, because you do such great work. Thank you. And I want anybody who's engaged in any form of public engagement or any form of public science, never ever forget that there's just one person maybe that your life is changed by the fact that you've done that. And you will never know. And we just do it because we know we need to, because otherwise what are we all fighting for? Sorry. Not sorry at the same time.
We've just got one here. Gabrielle.
Just a quick comment. Having recently retired from the state government, a successful piece of advocacy to Treasury, to the Premier, to the Treasurer, around what turned out to be a $500 million Science and Innovation Fund. The arguments that worked in our government were about job creation. Mm-hmm. That's what moves government's dials. That's what gets money into a fund. And if you keep it as simple as that, with some good economic modelling that Treasury understands. I love Keith's comments because you stirred me into making these remarks tonight. But it can be done. But to me, in New South Wales, that was success, talking about the number of jobs that will come from some of the companies that you've talked about. And government has patient capital. They don't have to get a return in a 3 or a 5 year period like a PE or a VC that's somewhat longer. So I'm very optimistic about that. And I look toward examples, say, for example, it was led by former Premier of Queensland who had a personal vision. That can work as well. Look to Victoria. Victoria doesn't want to be outdone by Queensland. So what the government's done there on a decadal basis for the medical research institutes and the hospitals there has wanted to keep pace with Queensland. So rather than it being leadership from the front, it's actually been, we don't want to be falling behind Queensland. So in many ways, to skin a cat is how I would represent that to you. But I don't want us to go home feeling like this is not possible.
Oh, it's
But economic modelling
possible.
around job creation, that talks to treasurers, it talks to premiers, and that's the way to prosecute the argument.
That's really
Thank you,
valuable.
Gabrielle.
Thank you. There was a question just here.
Just to add very quickly too, that the new forms of philanthropy I'm finding very interesting. So the Schmidt Ocean Institute has in the last 10 years put in $500 million US just into one vessel. So if the state government's putting $500 million Australian, which is what, 350 million, they're not even putting in what one philanthropic family is putting into one research vessel. It's not enough. It's not enough.
Okay, thanks very much. Tibor Molnar, Sydney University, Philosophy. A curly question just to end on, just for fun. We talked about language and we spoke about how we don't know what to call artificial intelligence. What I'd like to do is actually maybe suggest that we don't even know what we're talking about. I'd like to suggest that I'm artificially intelligent. I was trained by reinforcement learning from my mother. She said, don't do this and don't do that thousands of times. She was paid a peanuts, she was paid a pittance to train me. So I matched the criteria.
She also told you all the things to do.
Well, she did. So I'm biased in all the right ways. I'm also artificially intelligent. So I think we need to think about what it is that this species is doing in the context of what we ourselves are doing. Because what we're really doing is we're building a mirror of ourselves. And we mustn't forget that. I think that's the way to handle AI. It's not the way to say, oh, there's this evil machine coming along and it's going to do something, it's going to do what we do. And we're already doing it to each other and to ourselves, and I think we need to handle it as just a small extension of the way humans are and the human condition is. I think that's a way to think about it.
That's a fabulous way to end this conversation. And with that, what I'd really like to do is thank Catherine and invite you all to thank Catherine.
My training's still going on. I'm Liz Deane and I'm the Secretary of the Events Committee, so we do all this organising, or a lot of that, a little bit. So thank you very much. I mean, my mind was blown away. I couldn't even think of an intelligent question to ask, but everyone else did some great questions, so that was really good. It's very hard to not come away a bit depressed, I think. I feel a bit depressed about, or impotent is probably how I'd describe how I feel. But anyway, thank you. It has been a really, really stimulating talk. Lots of things I probably had never thought about before, except I think what you've said is war is going to stimulate more development than maybe space has, I think. Yes. That may not be the sort of war we're used to, yes. Anyway, thank you very much. It has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation and wonderful questions from the audience, and thank you very much for coming.